Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our new conference today. My name is Alireza Jafarzadeh, and I'm a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, NCRI, which seeks the establishment of a democratic, secular, non-nuclear republic in place of the current ruling theocracy. Welcome to this important news conference. The IRGC papers exposing IRGC's elaborate international scheme to evade sanctions and finance terror. This conference is quite timely because of growing international concern over the regime's nuclear weapons program, its military assistance in Ukraine conflict, and its continued mischief in the Middle East, and its hindrance of maritime shipping in the Persian Gulf. This highly sensitive and classified information, which includes letters exchanged among regime's top brass, such as the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, shed light on the extent to which the ruling theocracy is willing to go to circumvent sanctions to secure the necessary funds that will enable it to finance its terrorism, warmongering, and destabilizing activities in the Middle East beyond, as well as empowering its security forces to crack down on protesters and uprisings that have shaken the regime to its core. I give the floor to my esteemed colleague, Alireza Jafarzadeh, who is the Deputy Director of the NCRI's Washington office. And now, without further ado, I ask Alireza to take the podium.
Thank you so much, Ali, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming to our office at the National Council of Resistance of Iran, U.S. Representative Office. I would like to present to you today the most detailed, well-documented information about a very elaborate scheme by the Iranian regime to basically fund terror by circumventing sanctions and providing funds and secure those terror operations, but also suppression inside the country. And I'm going to use the PowerPoint presentation to present to you the evidence and the information today. Without further ado, let's start with the source. Where does the information come from? It's actually coming, as before, from the network inside Iran of the main Iranian opposition organization, the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran, or the MEK, which is the pivotal member organization within the National Council of Resistance of Iran. It also comes from the network of the MEK inside the various agencies or organs of the Iran regime, particularly the armed forces, where the bulk of this information is actually focused on that. So we've called this the IRGC papers. They're a set of documents and information that we have obtained from inside the Iranian regime that basically shows the evidence of what we have said earlier today, that the Iran regime has been circumventing sanctions and funding terror and repression inside the country. So the main focus today will be on Petrochemical Commercial Company International. We'll be referring to it as PCCI, which is the entity that actually bypasses the oil and petrochemical sanctions in astronomical dimensions. We're talking about very large numbers, and then spending the resulting financial benefits to promote the regime's terrorism abroad and suppression inside the country. But let's, in order to better understand what we're talking about, let's take a look at the structure of the regime, where this entity actually stands within the structure of the Iran regime. The regime created a mechanism to what they call the resistance economy, which is code name for circumventing sanctions. And the entire task for that is actually given and allocated to the armed forces of the regime. And all of the resources, the economy is actually practically has come under the control of the armed forces. You can see here the Supreme Leader, and then you have the Armed Forces Chief of Staff, IRGC Major General Mohammad Bagheri. He's a very veteran member of the IRGC over the years. He's the one who oversees all of these such activities. And they have created something called the Headquarters for Resistance Economy, headed by another IRGC commander, Asghar Saleh Sohani. Is an IRGC admiral whose job of this headquarters is to basically control the economy, bring it under the control of the military, the armed forces, and then circumvent sanctions. Let's look at the next layer under the headquarters. You can see all of the, you have the state security forces headed by Major Alireza Jafarzadeh. He's an IRGC person. And you have the IRGC itself, headed by the Major General Hossein Salami, is an IRGC commander. And then you have the Army Chief, Major General Abdurrahim Musavi. And then you have the Minister of Defense that basically does all the coordinations, headed by now by Mohammad Reza Ashtiani. Let's go one layer further. Here's the top organization that has been overseeing all of such activities. It's called Armed Forces Social Security Organization. The abbreviation is actually SATA, headed by IRGC Brigadier General Majid Ibn Reza. And it is this organization, SATA, that oversees all of the financial activities, the resources, the procurement, and the allocation of the resources to the military. It goes through them. And then you have a number of major organizations that go under them. Our interest is focused on this one. That's Qadir Investment Company, headed by Maziar Hosseini. He's a close protege of Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who a veteran member, commander of the Revolutionary Guards, who is now the head of the parliament. And then this Qadir Investment Company is a huge financial institution. It has over 140 companies. It has at least 8 major holdings. One of those holdings is right here. And we're talking about billions of dollars of interactions. It owns almost everything in oil and petrochemical industry. They have at least 29 oil and petrochemical refineries all over the country. Now, one of those holdings is actually Parsian Oil and Gas Development Group, headed by the IRGC Brigadier General Ahmad Wahid Dastjardi. You may know about him. He has been all over for the past 30, 40 years, a veteran of the Iran-Iraq War. Anything, anywhere that were money and resources and his relationship with the IRGC, Ahmad Wahid Dastjardi has been there. And he has newly been appointed as the head, within the past 2 years, as the head of the board of directors of the Parsian Oil and Gas Development Group. And then here is Petrochemical Commercial Company International, PCCI. In other words, PCCI is actually the front organization, is the entity that does all of those transactions in order to provide a fund for these organizations, going all the way to to SATA. So we have a lot of things to talk about, all of the these issues, but today's press conference is actually focused on this particular entity, the PCCI. So let's get a better picture. I went back to the big chart So you can see like where PCCI stands, and that's Parsian, that's Ghadir, and that's SATA, and the Ministry of Defense, and the headquarters for resistance economy. And then you have the chairman of Chief of Staff of Armed Forces, Bagheri, and then, of course, the Supreme Leader controls everything at the end of the day. Now, we're going to go to the documents, some of the documents to actually show the evidence of what we're actually discussing today. The PCCI was actually established in 2000 in Jersey. It's one of the small islands in the Channel Island in the UK. It's a free trade zone. But in May 2011, the US actually designated, the State Department designated PCCI under the Iran Sanctions Act. That's a secondary sanctions. And then shortly after, in August 2011, the PCCI actually moved from the Channel Island to Labuan Island. That's in Malaysia. That's actually, Labuan is a free trade island, as I said, similar to the previous one. Just to give you an idea, that's in Jersey, the small island right here, in UK, and then moving it, registering it now in Labuan, Malaysia, because this will give them a totally different cover. This will give them the ability to further evade sanctions and move away attention to whatever they were doing before. Now, the PCCI currently has 4 trust companies. It has offices in the UAE in Jebel Ali Free Zone. It has 1 trust company in Turkey. It also is the largest Iranian entity with a history of presence and activity in Turkmenistan, and everyone knows Turkmenistan. They have one of the largest gas reserves in the world. If you're doing anything in petrochemical world, Turkmenistan is right there. And so that's not by accident that the PCCI actually has an office right there. So let's get into the details of some of the activities of the PCCI. They are in charge of selling the crude oil quota that is allocated to the armed force. And I will elaborate a little further on that one based on the documents that we have obtained. And the document shows actually the extent, the dimension of the crude oil that is allocated to the armed forces. Here's document number 2 that you will get in your package. It's a letter actually written by then Defense Minister Amir Hatami to the Supreme Leader Khamenei. It's a 3-page document with the stamp and the details of it. The document basically is dated October 24, 2022. It basically, one particular paragraph is right here. This is the Farsi paragraph right before his signature. Amir Hatami's signature is right here. He basically reminds everyone that the 990,000 barrels of the approved export of 1.46 barrels of oil per day actually belongs to the Petro Oil Refinery, the companies and the entities that are affiliated with the armed forces, and what is called the Setad Ijraiye Farman Imam, referring to execution of Khomeini's order, also known as ACO or Setad. This is a huge conglomerate that is controlled by the Supreme Leader. The assets are way over perhaps $200 billion. One study back in 2013 confirmed close to $100 billion of their assets. So think about this number. This is about 2/3 of the entire crude oil export that was dedicated for that year in 2020. And of that, 2/3 of that quota belongs to the armed forces. They are the ones who sell it and get the money and the resources, and that's where the money goes. If anyone is wondering, where does the money of the Iranian regime, sale of oil and petrochemicals and gas and everything, where do they go? A huge bulk of it, directly based on this information, this evidence, goes to the armed forces. And when we talk about armed forces, the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, is at the center of it. They dominate all of the armed forces. They're part of it, and they have the big share of everything. Of course, in the armed forces, you have the state security forces that are directly responsible for the suppression of the protesters. You have the Revolutionary Guards, and you have the army. So that by itself, I think that evidence is very damning to show how much money and resources has gone. And that's a process that's been continuing ever since. Now, the next document is document number 3. We've numbered it in the IRGC papers. It's dated in January 13, 2021. It's a letter. You can see the logo and the letterhead of the Parsian Oil and Gas Development Group, which is, as I showed on the chart, one of the subsidiaries, major subsidiaries of the Qadir Investment Group. In this document, this letter that goes from the Hossein Shahriari, the managing director of Parsian, goes to the Dr. Nimaziar Hosseini. He's actually the CEO of the Qadir Investment Company. That's his name, the CEO. And this is the signature of Hossein Shahriari. One of the things he mentions here, he says that considering the specialty of selling crude oil, PCCI was entrusted with the sale of crude oil for the general staff of the armed forces, and under letter number 1399/1003, that's a far date. That's that's in 2000, year 2000. This was officially communicated to PCCI. So, in other words, is saying that we are officially in charge of selling crude oil and bringing the funds back to Iran and providing it to the resources. Another aspect in that same letter that shows that he talks about the selling Venezuela's oil, because Venezuela is another rogue country that is sanctions, both in terms of their oil export. Their national oil company is also designated. Actually, their oil company was designated on the same date, on the same day that the PCCI was designated in 2011. So it says a contract for the sale of Venezuelan crude oil in the amount of 5 million barrels of extra heavy crude oil per month for 1 year. So that's like, the list of some of the things that they have done. So that's another area where, money and, of course, political expediency is right there. And then talking about the Houthis in Yemen. They are selling to the Houthis the things they actually they need for their terror operations, for bomb making and all that. In that same letter, it's talking about selling the chemical product urea, which is also known as carbamide, exported by the Minister of Defense to the Yemen, and referring to the Houthis in Yemen. That material is a key material if anyone is building explosives, bombs, and all of that. That's a key element. So PCCI is right there, involved in actually supporting and funding and procuring necessary means for terrorism. Then you have who else among the the allies of the Iran regime, that's Assad in Syria. In that same letter, there's reference to implementing the provisions of the Memorandum of Understanding between the Ministry of Defense with the Ministry of Oil of Syria. That has been assigned to PCCI. So the Memorandum of Understanding they signed, who is going to execute it, who is going to implement it, that's the PCCI. That's where they have come into the picture. And there's a lot more evidence further elaborating on the role that the PCCI has played in Syria. Now, in terms of transferring currency, this is another document that is dated January 13, 2021 letter by Ali Adibi. That's the signature and the name right here. He's the Director of Legal Affairs of the Qadir Investment Company, written to Mr. Naiji, who is actually Vice President for Corporate Affairs of Qadir Investment Company. In that letter, Adibi says PCCI performs currency transfer operations. This is as specific as you can get in showing that this entity is involved in actually transferring currency for the Iran regime and for the specifically the armed forces. It says, as a foreign company, PCCI buys manufactured items from Iranian companies and sells them to foreign customers, and then basically bringing the benefits, the resources back to Iran. Now, this is there's another document that actually attests to the same fact. This is a letter signed again by the same person, Ali Adibi, to this one. It's actually to Dr. Hosseini, the CEO of Qatir, Maziar Hosseini, Qadir Investment Company. That's Maziar Hosseini, and this is Mohammad Baqir Ghalibaf. He was actually, before he was appointed to this position, he was actually the deputy for Mohammad Baqir Ghalibaf, and Ghalibaf was a veteran member of the Revolutionary Guards, a brigadier general. He was involved in suppression of the protesters back in 1999 and afterwards during the student movement, and he was a presidential candidate, a close ally actually of Supreme Leader Khamenei. He is actually Ghalibaf's protege. Now, in that letter, Adibi says that this company, PCCI, can perform currency transfer operations efficiently. That means, with the least amount of overhead and with the largest percentage of success. They have done it, and this is the leading entity within the Iran regime to actually circumvent sanctions and do the job for the armed forces of the regime that no other entity has been able to do. Now, talking about the heavy oil, crude oil shipment, here's another that talks about, it's an October 2022 report that's pretty recent by PCCI Managing Director to Dr. Hosseini, Maziar Hosseini, the CEO of Qadir Investment Company. It gives like one example here that a heavy crude oil shipment of 760,000 barrels was loaded from the southern ports of Iran, and 32 ships of Iranian light crude oil were loaded with the amount of 1,070,000 barrels from the northern ports of the Caspian Sea, and $100 million from the mentioned budget was made available to the Ministry of Defense. They're actually giving a specific number here, the amount of the crude oil that moved, and interestingly, this is the entity that operates both down south in the Persian Gulf and also in the Caspian Sea. They claim that they are the only entity that they operate in both places, down south and the north in the Caspian Sea. And now in that same report, it talks about also that 605,000 tons of urea exported from Kermanshah, Pardis, and Shiraz petrochemical companies. These three entities are all subsidiaries of Qadir investment company. As I mentioned, they have about 29, I believe, petrochemical refineries and entities and companies. So from those three, 605 tons of urea were sold by this company between 2019 and 2022. Within 3 years, that's the amount that they have allocated to that. Now, again, talking about Syria, going back to Syria, that's very important. This is another letter. This one is written by Hossein Shahriari, who was the actually the managing director of the Persian oil and gas, Parsian oil and gas development group that was addressed to Hosseini. And then he talks about PCCI actually accompanying the Minister of Defense delegation going to Syria. It says PCCI accompanied the delegation of the Minister of Defense to Syria to supply Syria with oil. And a joint committee was formed between Syria and Iran for the development of joint economic cooperation. And everyone knows the joint economic cooperation between the two dictators, what that amounts to, and what they're actually talking about. Now, we talked about what the regime has been doing outside of Iran, but let's just spend a few minutes talking about inside the country, how the PCCI, how Qadir, and all of the entities under SATA have been actually funding, in addition to killing and the protesters, actually providing the funds, some of the funds that they obtained by circumventing sanctions to suppress the protests. Here are 3 documents, and there are several others. I just picked these 3 that you can see the letterhead. This one is a letter from SATA. That's the emblem of the Minister of Defense, and that's SATA under that. This one is the Parsian Oil and Gas Development Group. You can see the logo and the letterhead right here. And that one is actually from the Minister of Defense going. Now, the purpose of all the 3 letters that are somehow interrelated is about providing funds to those who actually suppressed a particular act of demonstration in October 2022 in the height of these uprisings that started since September of 2022, that they are giving money for one particular demonstration on that day in southern Khuzestan for the killings that they have done suppressing the protesters. Basically the documents show that the Parsian Gas and Oil Development Company, using some of its subsidiaries, one of them is Pardis Petrochemical Company, they funded the suppression of the workers in southern Iran who actually revolted against the Pardis company. They wired 4 billion riyals to SATA. 4 billion riyals to SATA, which, as I said earlier, is the Armed Forces Social Security Organization, to suppress that particular demonstration on October 18, 2022 in Asaliya Economic Region. And that was a major protest. We put out a number of statements at the time about that particular protest. We have video clips. We don't have the time to show it here, but we have the video clips of that protest. People, the workers and the others who were there chanting, "Death to Khamenei, death to the dictator." They were also chanting, "Now is the year of sacrifice, and Sayyid Ali," referring to Khamenei, "will be overthrown." This is in line with all the major slogans of the protest all over the country, as people have been chanting death to Khamenei, death to the dictator, or death to the oppressor, be it the Shah or the supreme leader. Now, let me sum up what I said until now, and then just also spend a couple of minutes about another issue that is actually very relevant. What we discussed so far is all about deception, is all about lies, is all about how to circumvent, how to beguile the outside world about what the regime is actually doing. And this is the nature of this regime. This is the DNA of the regime. Lies and deceptions have been part and parcel, no matter what they're doing, no matter what area it is. Now, another area that the world might be a little bit more familiar with is the nuclear weapons program of the Iranian regime, that the regime has been lying to its teeth since the very beginning. If it weren't for the revelation of the National Council of Resistance of Iran back in August of 2002, revealing the nuclear sites in Natanz and Iraq, which actually triggered for the first time the IAEA inspections of Iranian nuclear sites, God knows where the regime would have been. A good portion of all of the sites that are now being inspected by the IAEA were actually revealed by this movement. And they have been, everything they're faced with the evidence that shows up. The regime is just like finding a way to explain it away, to lie, and just to cover up. And one very important example is the underground nuclear facility near Qum, known as Fordow. Now, this is the site in Fordow. Why is this site significant? This site was actually being built underground when we first exposed it in 2005 in a press conference in Paris by NCRI. And we said that they were building underground facilities here. No one really did anything until 2009, when more information came out about this. Then it became public that under the mountains, very deep under the mountains, the regime was building a uranium enrichment facility there. Now, as part of the nuclear deal in 2015, what the regime did was they said, okay, we'll keep the centrifuges, that are over 1,000 of them, but we would never feed any uranium hexafluoride. It would just be there, and it would be just for experimental purposes, only operating with vacuum, no nuclear feed. Well, that's not the case, and this is one of the major sites that the regime has been enriching uranium under the mountains, very high level, way beyond the peaceful level of 3.67, 20%, 60%, and all that. Now, this site, which is one of the centers of contention between the IAEA and the regime, an information came out just a few days ago by a group called Qiyam Ta Saneguni, meaning uprising until the overthrow, that showed that the regime, the evidence was presented that the regime was actually expanding this site big time and adding land and area to it. They have added 370 acres of land to both supposedly improve security, but also have the ability to expand the site. Now, this is a site under the mountains that the regime has been lying to its teeth about this, and now they're expanding it. So what does that tell you about the intentions of the Iran regime? That's the letter that they put out just a couple days ago. And the reason I bring it up here, even though it's not related to what I discussed earlier, but I think it's so important to know that everywhere you look at it, whether it's their oil and gas industry, whether it's their the sanctions issue, whether it's their nuclear program, whether it's their killings inside the country, whether it's the disinformation they spread against their, the uprising against their main opposition, they all are built on lies and deception. And basically, this document shows that, as I said, they've added 370 acres of additional land. Right here, it talks about the right here. It mentions 149 hectare, but when you convert hectare to acre, that's equivalent of 370 acres of land that is officially allocated by the regime. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that's the place that we first exposed, but why is the regime doing it? There are two reasons they're doing it in Fardo. One, they want to rapidly expand Fardo and accelerate the uranium enrichment operations, but also the other purpose is actually to, the protracting and the extending and expanding the negotiations, dragging it with the IAEA, basically misleading the agency, and so that this way the regime will not be referred to the UN Security Council. This is a call that we've been repeatedly making. So, having said that, let me just conclude what we discussed today and what it really means. I think the information clearly shows today that the regime has been defying sanctions, violating international laws, and funding its terror operations, continuing with its nuclear weapons program, and suppressing its own population during the protest. And the appeasement policy, how did all this happen? Somebody has to create a space for the regime to operate. And that's where the role of Western nations come into picture, including the United States. Especially in the past 2.5 years, the appeasement policy allowed the Iranian regime to be able to do all of these things. No focus has been on any of these activities by the Iranian regime. Instead, they've been talking about going back to the JCPOA. What does going back to the JCPOA means? It means actually lifting sanctions. So this, in the midst of talks of lifting sanctions, the regime finds room to maneuver, finds the space, and that's why it allowed the regime to do all of those things, including most recently, this is a convicted terrorist, Asrullah Asadi, who was involved in the terror plot in 2018 to bomb a huge gathering of NCRI. And he was arrested, convicted, sentenced to 20 years. He spent 5 years of that and was just released by actually by the King of Belgium, defying the court's rulings, which we had successfully fought and won. Basically, at the end of the day, with the king and the ministers who jumped in and got him released. Imagine if the policies were different, if the policies were firm, these things could not have happened. So, in other words, every dollar that is actually given to the Iran regime under any pretext, it goes into funding terrorism. Don't ever buy this notion that, oh, yes, the money lifting sanctions, providing money to Iran is going to improve the economy. This is not the case. It's going to improve the ability of the IRGCs, the ability of the armed forces. But particularly, appeasement is always wrong, but it's really immoral, especially now, since the uprising, when people of Iran in large numbers, huge numbers, are rejecting the regime, calling for change in the country. Now, what should be done? I think the first step, the Congress must really jump in. This is the role that they can play. They can, introduce bills, all kinds of new laws and regulations to prevent the regime from evading the sanctions and pursuing its nuclear defiance in order to rush to the bomb. And of course, the administration should do a lot better job in implementing even the sanctions that are already in place, as weak as they are, but they're not being implemented. Finally, we believe, given all the evidence that I just presented today, and we'll be also on the nuclear side and the nuclear defiance of the regime, this is the time for the US and Western nations to reimpose all UN Security Council resolutions, the 6 of them, and put the regime on its back foot. This way, that's how you can meaningfully stand on the side of the people of Iran. So with that, I want to conclude this part of our presentation today, and I'd like to open the floor to questions, and we're going to start with the journalists who are here. Please, if you have a question, raise your hand, introduce yourself. There's a microphone available that could be actually circulated. Any questions, please? Yes, please.
This is Camby Stavano with Voice of America. Have you shared this information with OFAC? If so, what were their response?
Thank you so much. Yes, this information has been shared with the Treasury Department, specifically with OFAC, and also relevant government agencies. I'm not aware of their response, but certainly with this level of details, I think they have a lot of work to do. Appreciate that. Please, yes.
I don't
Yes.
I was, thank you so much. It's so interesting, important. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about who it is that you assess to be ending up with the oil, who the ultimate buyers are. The documents point to Syria, and you talked about that. There's one document that has many, many sales listed to some sort of transfers to Turkey, and there's a little bit of mention of China. I bring this up because there's an organization in New York called United Against Nuclear Iran, and they've spent the last few years documenting Chinese oil purchases, Chinese purchases of Iranian oil, to the extent to which the failure of the Biden administration's push to redo the JCPOA, actually the administration has in recent months been saying we're going to increase pressure on China to stop buying Iranian oil. Can you comment on these things? Who's ultimately buying the oil? Is Turkey actually buying it, or is that a reference to transshipment? And then with regard to the administration's comments about cracking down on or pressuring China, is that enough? Because it's not mentioned in your recommendations. So I'm sorry, there's a lot there. Thank you.
Yes, no, thank you. This was a question from Guy Taylor from the Washington Times, and those of you who did not hear the question in the microphone, his question is basically who are the buyers of the oil that is being sold through PCCI, who are the beneficiaries in terms of countries and the partners. Well, these documents don't get into those details because the purpose of these documents, these are mostly internal things that circumvent. There are mentions, as you mentioned, mentions of China, for instance, and Venezuela is actually there mentioned, and a number of countries. We don't have all of those details, but I think for the U.S. government, for the Treasury Department, for those whose job is actually to dig in and figure out where does all of these resources are going, especially given the amount of information and the traces that we provided, names of individuals and the companies and locations and all of that. All of them are very significant leads and clues for them to follow up, and I would appreciate if you would follow up with the relevant government agencies because I think this is extremely important to get to the bottom of it, to know exactly where it goes, but even more important than that, to stop it. This needs to be stopped because no matter where it goes, the outcome is that the fund, we know where the fund goes to the Revolutionary Guards, it goes to the armed forces, it goes to funding terror operations in the region from Syria to to Lebanon, to Iraq, to Houthis in Yemen, and you name it. That needs to be stopped. And I think the whole purpose of our press conference today is this is a wake-up call for the administration, for everybody, not just here in Washington, but every capital in Europe and other countries. that this huge amount of resources and money is being funneled illegally against all of the sanctions that these countries have implemented, imposed on on this regime, but they're not working. Thank you, Guy. Appreciate it. Any other questions we have? Do we have any questions? Yeah, please go ahead.
Some questions from
Yes.
folks who are watching this online. Can I have the mic, please?
Yes, the first question is from John Bowden from The Independent. He's interested to know how U.S. can and should craft sanctions going forward that cannot be evaded. Also, is this merely an issue of insufficient enforcement, or is lack of more robust sanctions to prevent Iranian regime and the IRGC from evading the sanctions?
Thank you so much. So, respond to the question of John Bowden from The Independent. Well, it's a combination of all of those things, because there are sanctions imposed in some of those individuals I named here, or entities that I named here. But these sanctions are mostly secondary sanctions. So you need to really tighten the sanctions to begin with. You need much stronger layers. A lot of these entities fall under the FTO designation because they are engaged in funding and providing resources for terrorist operations. They need to be designated as sanctioned under the FTO. That's one step. Second, in terms of implementation, what has been done since 2011, that PCCI was designated, even though it was under the ISA. I have never seen anything that relates to implementing anything related to the PCCI. At least I couldn't find it on the internet. Nothing, and certainly nothing meaningful, because those operations not only didn't stop, but expanded. They're boasting about this, that we're just like operating with, with impunity. They have a free hand in, conducting all of their operations. So in that sense, that's extremely important to do both, to strengthen, but also to implement it. But you won't be able to implement it if your overall policy is going a different direction. If the policy is a policy of appeasement, I think it's moot to talk about implementing sanctions, because the whole policy of appeasement, the whole purpose is to lift the sanctions, is to give room to operate for the regime. So even though the question is a technical one, but in reality, it's a very political question. It boils down to the policy of the United States. It boils down to the policy of these European nations. Where are you heading? What are you trying to do? Are you siding with the people of Iran and tightening noose on the repressors, or you are providing room and space for the IRGC repressive forces to operate freely, to have funds to kill their own people, but also fund terrorism? That's why I think it's extremely important, especially after the past 2.5 years, that the policy of appeasement has proven to be counterproductive. It hasn't altered the behavior of the Iran regime. To the contrary, it has further encouraged the regime to continue the same path. And you notice a lot of the evidence we provided, they were all within that framework of the past, most of them in the past 2.5 years. Yeah. Thank you. Go ahead. Any other questions?
There's one more question. It's from Todd Wood of
CD Media. Todd is asking, what do you expect the administration do with respect to all these activities by the IRGC and the regime? Hundreds of sanctions are already in place. What more can the admin do to prevent this?
Well, thank you for the question by Todd Wood. I think in a way I answered that question, but I think that gives me the chance to re-emphasize on some of those points that I mentioned. Yes, there are sanctions already in place. A, they are inadequate. B, they're not being implemented. And the reason behind all of both A and B is the policy. The policy of appeasement, the policy of accommodation, the policy of continuously trying to reach out to the regime, the policy of the negotiating with the Iranian regime, repeatedly telling them that the JCPOA is on the table, they can get back to negotiations. This is absolutely a wrong approach, that the outcome, for whatever reason they're doing it, the outcome is exactly the opposite. And it has further strengthened the regime's terror operations, even though the regime itself is weaker inside the country, is largely rejected by the entirety of the population. People have been in the streets in the past 9 months, despite all the ups and downs. But the goal of getting rid of the regime, as far as the people of Iran are concerned, has not changed. The very elements that led to the uprising, the latest round of uprising since September 2022, are still there. The economy, the corruption, the lack of political freedoms. It's even worse. So that's why our advice to the administration and also to the countries in Europe is that look at the realities of Iran deeply and abandon the policy of appeasement, abandon the policy of accommodation, rely on the people of Iran. Change is imminent. The people of Iran have decided to end the rule of the Ayatollahs, and this will happen. I think we have no other questions. I want to thank everybody for attending the press conference today, and we'll be available if there are any further questions. Thank you.